Emperor Nero, the most powerful man in the known world, was strolling leisurely. His gait was somewhat theatrical, each step seemingly calculated to draw attention. Beside him, walking in almost sacred silence, was the emperor's presumed new wife. She was a masterpiece of opulence. Precious silks from the East fabrics reserved for royalty softly embraced her slender figure, their colors shifting with every movement in the afternoon sun, from the pink of dawn to the purple of twilight. Jewels sparkled on her neck wrists, and a small diadem nestled in her elaborately styled hair, arranged in the fashion of Roman noblewomen. Her face was delicate, her skin porcelain white, her eyes large and deep, meticulously made up to enhance their allure. She was the embodiment of beauty, wealth, and status, a true empress. Yet as their majestic carriage glided past, whispers began to buzz like cicadas behind them, a malicious, astonished murmur. The onlookers, the guards, and even the senators who happened to be present exchanged knowing glances. They knew a truth, a horrifying, twisted truth, one that stained the empire's grandeur. They knew that the splendid woman walking beside the emperor, called Sabina, treated like a living goddess, was in fact not a woman. That person, only a short time ago, was a boy named Sporus. The name Sporus was passed in whispers, not with pity, but with morbid curiosity and undisguised revulsion. The story of what Nero did to that boy was not merely an act of tyranny by a despot, but one of the most disturbing examples of psychological and physical abuse ever recorded in history. It is not just a tale of a mad emperor, but a journey into the mind of a person driven to the brink of inhumanity by grief and absolute power, a person who tried to bend reality itself to fill the void in his soul, regardless of the cost to another's life and identity. This story begins not with Sporus, but with the woman he was forced to replace, a ghost that still haunted the palace and Nero's mind, Empress Poppaea Sabina. Nero was not born a monster. History often tends to simplify complex figures into archetypes of good or evil, but the truth about Nero, as with most people, lies in shades of gray. When he ascended to the throne at the age of 16, all of Rome placed great hopes in this young, educated, and seemingly mild-mannered man. The early years of his reign, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, were a promising period of prosperity and stability. Under the guidance of talented advisors like Seneca and Burrus, Nero implemented popular policies. He reduced taxes for the poor, an act that depleted the imperial treasury, but earned him the love of the common people. He was a generous patron of the arts and public entertainment. Arenas were built, festivals were held regularly, and the people of Rome enjoyed spectacular performances, from chariot races to gladiatorial contests. Nero himself was an artist. He was passionate about music, poetry, and drama. He not only sponsored other artists, but also yearned to be on stage, to be applauded by the public for his talent rather than his royal blood. He performed in plays, himself played the lyre, and sang songs of his own composition. For the conservative Roman aristocracy, this act was an insult. An emperor should not stoop to being an entertainer. But for Nero, it was the most genuine expression of who he was, an artistic soul trapped in the gilded cage of power. In those early years, one could see a different Nero, a benevolent, generous, and somewhat naive Nero. But power, especially absolute power, is a poison that slowly and surely erodes the soul. By about 65 AD, the change in Nero had become evident. The promising young man had vanished, replaced by a paranoid, cruel, and increasingly erratic tyrant. This decay could be attributed to many factors. Perhaps it was the growing paranoia as he saw plots to overthrow him everywhere. Perhaps it was the isolation of supreme power where no one dared to speak the truth to the emperor, only flattery and false consensus. Or perhaps, and this is a very strong possibility, his downfall stemmed from a personal tragedy, from the death of the only woman he truly loved, in an obsessive, possessive, and ultimately insane way, Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was more than just a beautiful woman. Her beauty was legendary, praised by poets and recorded by historians, but behind that graceful exterior lay a sharp mind and a burning ambition. She understood the power of her looks, but she understood even better how power operated within an empire. Poppaea possessed a keen political instinct, an ability to manipulate and charm not just men, but political factions. She wasn't a passive pawn on the chessboard. She was an active player always seeking to advance. When Nero met Poppaea, he was already married to Claudia Octavia, the daughter of Emperor Claudius. It was a political marriage, cold and loveless. Octavia embodied traditional Roman virtues, discreet, virtuous, and somewhat dull. She was a shadow in the palace, a politically necessary presence, but utterly invisible in Nero's heart. Poppaea was her complete opposite. She was vivacious, strong, intelligent, and unafraid to express her desires. She was fire to Octavia's ice, and for a man with an artistic soul and a craving for intense emotions like Nero, Poppaea was like a breath of fresh air, an endless source of inspiration. Their affair began like a whirlwind, passionate and intense, but it quickly transformed into a toxic obsession on Nero's part. His love was not appreciation or respect, but an absolute desire for possession. He became erratic and pathologically jealous. He assigned Praetorian guards to watch over Poppaea's residence, not to protect her, but to monitor her every move. Every visitor, every letter sent, had to pass his scrutiny. He showered her with gifts so extravagant they bordered on the ridiculous strings of pearls from the Persian Gulf diamonds from India, even a fleet of ships carrying exotic animals just to please her. But these gifts were not expressions of love. They were golden chains, reminders that she belonged to him. Nero began to manipulate reality to fit his desires. He sought every means to divorce Octavia, despite the objections of his advisors and the public's affection for the unfortunate empress. Finally, he falsely accused Octavia of adultery and treason, exiled her to a distant island, and then ordered her assassination. Immediately thereafter, he held a lavish wedding with Poppaea, a grand ceremony intended to declare to the world that she was now empress, his only woman. But his possessiveness didn't stop there. He gradually isolated Poppaea from her family and friends, people whom he believed could have a bad influence on her or diminish her devotion to him. The palace became a gilded cage where her only interactions were with those chosen by Nero. He commissioned countless portraits and statues of her throughout Rome, not to honor her, but to assert his ownership. Every Roman citizen, upon seeing Poppaea's image, had to remember that she belonged to Nero. This behavior revealed a deep and dangerous confusion in Nero's mind. He had confused love with possession, adoration with control. Poppaea, with her intelligence and political instinct, surely understood the danger of the game she was playing. She had achieved her goal of becoming Empress of Rome, but the cost was her own freedom. However, she was not one to be easily subjugated. She still tried to maintain some independence for herself, offering opinions contrary to Nero's, challenging his decisions, and preserving a private space for her own mind. She knew how to soothe his anger, how to manipulate his emotions, but it was a dangerous tightrope walk. She was dancing with a tiger, and any misstep could lead to disaster. And then disaster struck. In 65 AD, during a heated argument, tragedy ensued. Ancient historians provide varying accounts, but all point to a horrific act of violence. Poppaea was pregnant with their second child at the time. Perhaps it was due to her criticism of Nero's late return from a chariot race, or perhaps a more serious political matter. Whatever the cause, Nero's fury erupted uncontrollably. In a fit of madness, he brutally kicked or struck his pregnant wife's abdomen. The blow inflicted fatal injuries. Poppaea collapsed bleeding, and within hours she died in agony, along with their unborn child. Poppaea's death shattered something in Nero's mind. A break had occurred. His grief was not the sorrow of a husband losing his wife, but the horror of a possessor losing his most prized possession, the panic of an artist stripped of his muse. His pain was so immense it warped into madness. He refused to accept the truth. According to Roman tradition, the deceased were cremated, but Nero would not allow that to happen to Poppaea. He could not bear the thought of seeing her body consumed by flames. Instead, he ordered the finest embalmers to preserve her body, according to Egyptian pharaonic customs, an alien and bizarre act for Romans. Poppaea's embalmed body was placed in a lavish tomb. The mausoleum of Augustus and Nero declared her a goddess, a diva. But the madness did not stop there. For days, weeks afterward, Nero sank into a world of delusion. He spent hours each day in the mausoleum talking to Poppaea's embalmed corpse as if she were still alive. He told her about the day's events, asked for her opinion on state matters, and even grew angry when she didn't respond. Courtiers and servants in the palace were forced to participate in this morbid charade. They had to maintain the illusion that the empress was still alive. They had to prepare her meals, arrange her clothes, and speak of her in the present tense. Anyone who accidentally mentioned her death faced the emperor's wrath. The entire imperial palace had become a vast stage where everyone had to play their part in the tragedy of a widowed and insane emperor. Nero was not just grieving. He was trying to use his power to bend the laws of nature to deny death. But the corpse remained just a corpse, and its silence increasingly drove Nero to despair. He needed a Poppaea who could speak, move, and reciprocate his love. He needed a replacement. And it was during this period of grief and madness, as Nero frantically searched the empire for solace, that a figure appeared in his sight. It was Sporus. He was a young man about 14 or 15 years old, an age between the innocence of childhood and the blossoming of adulthood. Sporus was born into slavery, but by some stroke of luck he had been freed and raised within the palace environment. This meant he wasn't an uneducated slave. He received a good education, could read and write, and was likely taught arts and music to serve in the court. He was intelligent and aware, not an unthinking object. What made Sporus special in Nero's eyes was not his talent or intellect. It was a cruel coincidence of fate his face. According to historians, Sporus possessed an androgynous beauty with soft and delicate features. But most importantly, his face bore an uncanny resemblance to the deceased Empress Poppaea. Perhaps it was the shape of his cheekbones, the curve of his lips, or the contour of his chin. But above all, it was his eyes. Sporus's eyes were said to have the same shape, the same color, the same melancholic depth that Nero had once adored in Poppaea. To a sane mind, this resemblance might have been merely an interesting coincidence. But for Nero, steeped in delusion and despair, it was a sign from the gods. He didn't see a boy named Sporus. He saw an opportunity. He believed that fate had granted him a chance to bring Poppaea back from the dead. In Nero's distorted mind, Sporus was not a separate human being. He was a blank canvas, a lump of clay that he could mold into the image of his lost love. This was not a new love, but a desperate attempt to resurrect an old one. Nero decided that Sporus would become his Poppaea. There was only one obvious obstacle: Sporus was male. His gender was an undeniable biological fact. But for a Roman emperor who considered himself almost a god, who held life and death in his hands, changing a person's gender seemed like a minor hurdle, a technicality that could be resolved. Nero summoned the best and most trustworthy doctors in Rome. He didn't ask them if it could be done. He commanded them. His order was clear and horrifying. They were to perform a surgery on Sporus's body, a castration to remove his masculine features and make him appear more feminine. This act, even in Roman times, was considered barbaric. Castration was a dangerous procedure, incredibly painful and irreversible. It was performed without modern anesthesia, with only crude wine or opium to slightly dull the pain. The mortality rate from infection or shock was very high. But for Nero, Sporus's pain or risk of death was not a concern. His sole objective was to transform this boy into a replica of Poppaea. This surgery not only took away Sporus's fertility, it took away his future. He would never be able to have children, never be able to have normal relationships as a man. His gender identity was decided and altered by the emperor's knife. The surgery took place in the privacy of the palace, hidden from public view. We can only imagine the horror Sporus must have endured. He was held down, his body brutally violated, while robed men carried out the emperor's insane command. The physical pain must have been unimaginable, but the psychological terror even worse. In that moment, his old self Sporus was killed. When he awoke, his body was permanently altered, and a future he had not chosen had been imposed upon him. Miraculously, Sporus survived the surgery. After a period of agonizing recovery, when the wounds had healed, Nero announced his next plan. He would not just keep Sporus as a secret lover, he would marry him. Not just a private ceremony, but a full imperial wedding with all the rituals and pomp reserved for an empress. Nero wanted the whole world to witness the rebirth of Poppaea. He wanted to legitimize his delusion. The preparation for Sporus's new role began systematically and cruelly. First, he was given a new name. He was no longer Sporus. From now on, he would be called Sabina after the deceased empress. The name was the first step in completely erasing his old self. Next came the physical transformation. Sporus was fitted with a vast wardrobe of expensive silk gowns, elaborate sandals, and Poppaea's most magnificent jewelry. These items were not just clothing, they were a uniform, a way to conceal his remaining masculine features and create the illusion of a woman. He was instructed by makeup artists on how to use powders, kohl, and lipstick to soften his facial features, hide any hint of nascent stubble, and highlight the resemblance to Poppaea. His hair was grown long and styled by the most skilled hairdressers into intricate, complex updos, identical to Poppaea's preferred hairstyles. Every small detail was obsessively cared for to perfect the deception. But the real torture was not in the clothes or the makeup. It was the psychological torment. Sporus was forced to undergo a rigorous training to become a woman, or rather to become Poppaea. He was taught how to walk delicately with small, graceful steps. He was taught how to sit elegantly, how to gesture subtly with his hands. His voice was a major issue. After the surgery, his voice might have become higher, but it was still not a woman's voice. He was forced to practice for hours each day to speak with a higher, softer tone to imitate Poppaea's intonation and mannerisms. Every sound he made was scrutinized and corrected. He had to learn how to giggle, how to sigh, how to express surprise or joy in a feminine way. This was not acting. This was the obliteration of personality. Sporus was stripped of every natural expression of himself. Every movement, every word, every glance had to be calculated, had to be an imitation. He was trapped within his own body, forced to control it like a puppet at someone else's will. He had to think before he spoke, move consciously and constantly, self-censor to ensure he was playing the part perfectly. The psychological pressure must have been immense. Any slip, any hint of his old self, Sporus, could trigger Nero's wrath. He lived in constant fear and unending tension. And then the big day arrived. The wedding of Nero and Sabina was held in the spring of 67 AD. It was a lavish, magnificent event, a display of supreme power and wealth. All the traditional rites of a Roman wedding were meticulously observed. Sporus, in splendid bridal attire veiled in saffron-colored cloth, was escorted to Nero's home in a solemn procession. There was music, wedding songs, and shouted blessings. Nero, as the groom, performed all the rituals earnestly, from the exchange of rings to the sharing of the wedding cake. From the outside, to someone unaware of the truth, it might have looked like a normal imperial wedding. But for those present at the ceremony, the senators, the nobles, the members of the imperial family, the atmosphere was suffocating. They felt an inexpressible horror and discomfort. They were witnessing an elaborate deception, a blasphemy against both the gods and Roman tradition. They looked at the bride and saw a trembling boy beneath the makeup and silks. They looked at the emperor and saw a man utterly lost in his madness. No one dared to object, but their silence was more terrifying than any criticism. They were unwilling spectators in a morbid play, and their silence was their complicity. After the wedding, Sporus's new life as Empress of Rome began. Nero treated him as a legitimate empress in every respect. He had his own staff, including ladies-in-waiting servants and guards. He had his own suite of rooms in the palace, lavishly decorated with items Poppaea had loved. He was granted a vast income from the imperial treasury, possessing the power and influence of an empress. But all of this was merely the bars of a gilded cage. This role was a relentless psychological destruction. Sporus had to play the devoted wife in every interaction with Nero. Every morning upon waking, he had to be Poppaea. Every meal, he had to be Poppaea. Every conversation, he had to be Poppaea. The most terrifying thing was that Nero didn't see this as a game. In his mind, he genuinely believed he had succeeded in resurrecting his deceased wife. He spoke to Sporus about their shared memories, trips, arguments, secrets only he and the real Poppaea knew. And Sporus, in terror, had to pretend to remember. He had to learn to react as Poppaea would react based on the stories Nero told and what he overheard from servants. He had to guess the thoughts of a dead woman to stay alive. This deception required immense concentration and mental energy. Sporus had to be constantly vigilant, analyzing Nero's every word, trying to give the correct answer. A wrong answer, a moment of hesitation, a bewildered look could shatter the illusion and ignite the emperor's wrath. Over time, Sporus became very skilled at this deception. He learned to mimic Poppaea's smile, her head tilt, even her frown when displeased. But as he became more perfect in his role, his true self withered. He became withdrawn and melancholy. Behind the mask of Empress Sabina, Sporus was slowly dying. Historians recorded that the new empress often appeared sad and quiet, which courtiers interpreted as her modest nature, but the truth was the anguish of a captive soul. Every day was torture for Sporus. He had to live in rooms still scented with Poppaea's perfume, sleep in the bed she had once slept in, and look at portraits of the woman he was forced to become. He was surrounded by memories that were not his own, living a life that was not his own. His identity had been completely usurped. He was no longer Sporus, nor truly Sabina. He was a ghost, an emptiness, clothed in another's form. Nero's delusion was not confined to the palace walls. He wanted the whole world to recognize his new Poppaea. When Nero embarked on his grand tour of Greece, a trip primarily for him to participate in and rigged win artistic and athletic competitions, Sporus accompanied him. He was paraded before Greek officials and citizens as the Empress of Rome. He sat beside Nero in theaters, attended banquets, and received everyone's reverence. To the outside world, he was a symbol of Nero's absolute power, proof that the emperor could do anything he wished, even turn a boy into his wife. But for Sporus, each public appearance was a humiliation, a reminder of his dehumanized state. However, the reign of madness and excess could not last forever. By 68 AD, Nero's behavior had become unbearable to the Roman establishment. His cruelty, his executions of senators, his self-proclaimed status as a great artist, and especially his neglect of imperial administration to pursue personal pleasures had made him intolerable. Rebellions began to erupt in the provinces, first in Gaul, then in Spain, led by Governor Galba. News of the revolts reached Rome, and support for Nero began to waver. Finally, even the Praetorian Guard, the soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor, declared against him and supported Galba. Nero suddenly found himself abandoned and hunted. He had lost everything: power, loyalty, and safety. As Nero fled Rome in a panic seeking refuge, one person remained by his side. It was Sporus. In Nero's chaotic and desperate final hours, Sporus continued to play the loyal wife, following him from villa to villa. Perhaps it was because he had nowhere else to go, or perhaps a strange, morbid bond had formed between abuser and victim. Faced with capture and a humiliating execution, Nero finally chose death. But even in his last moments he hesitated, lacking the courage to take his own life. He had to enlist a slave to help him plunge the dagger into his throat. When he died, Sporus was there witnessing the downfall of the man who had created and destroyed his life. Nero's death should have been Sporus's liberation. His captor was dead. The play was over. But reality was far crueler. Nero's death did not free Sporus. It only made him incredibly vulnerable. He was no longer empress, nor could he return to being Sporus. He was a symbol, a living legacy of Nero's decadence, and thus he became a political pawn passed from hand to hand. After Nero's death, Rome plunged into a chaotic year of civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Sporus, with his beauty and scandalous past, was taken over by Nymphidius Sabinus, a Praetorian Guard commander who attempted to seize the throne. Nymphidius also forced Sporus to marry him, making him continue to wear women's clothing and calling him Sabina. When Nymphidius was killed, Sporus fell into the hands of Emperor Otho, an old friend of Nero's. Otho treated Sporus similarly, as a living memento of his deceased friend. Sporus was passed from one powerful man to another, each of whom continued Nero's abuse, forcing him to live the role he despised. He had become an object, a symbol of connection to the Neronian dynasty. The final and most horrific humiliation came under Emperor Vitellius, who defeated Otho. Vitellius was a coarse and cruel man, and he decided to use Sporus for a disgusting public spectacle. His plan was to bring Sporus to the Colosseum during one of the festivals. There, before tens of thousands of spectators, Sporus would be forced to reenact the role of a maiden kidnapped and raped in a mythological play. It was the ultimate dehumanization. His entire tragic life would be turned into a morbid entertainment for the crowd, a public display of violence and sexual humiliation. Faced with this horrifying prospect, Sporus made his final decision. He would not endure any more humiliation. He would not let Vitellius or anyone else turn his pain into a farce. Instead of being dragged into the arena, Sporus found a way to take his own life. He either took poison or hanged himself in his cell. This was around 69 AD. Sporus, or Sabina, or whatever name he was called, died when he was probably less than 20 years old. In death, Sporus finally found liberation. He escaped the disgusting theater that had consumed his life, freed from the costumes, the false names, and the imposed roles. Finally, he was at peace. His story quickly became a cautionary tale, a fable used by historians and moralists to illustrate the dangers of absolute power and the price of an emperor's excesses. Sporus is remembered as a victim, an extreme example of Nero's cruelty. But Sporus's story is even more haunting. It's not just a victim's story. It is a profound tragedy of identity and self-determination. The most terrible thing that happened to Sporus was not the castration, but the systematic and complete stripping of his identity. From the moment Nero decided he resembled Poppaea, Sporus, as an individual, ceased to exist. He was no longer a boy with his own hopes, dreams, and fears. He had become a mirror, a blank canvas for the emperor to paint his distorted fantasies and obsessions. He was forced to live another's life a ghost, and in the process his own soul was eroded until almost nothing remained. Yet Sporus's final act, his choice of death over humiliation, suggests that even after years of abuse and indoctrination, a spark of his original self still survived within him. It was a final act of defiance, a statement that even if they had taken his body, his name, and his future, they could not take his right to decide his own death. It was an act of reclaiming dignity in his final moments. We know very little about who Sporus truly was before Nero transformed him. His past, his personality, his true thoughts, all were erased, overwritten by the role of Sabina. History did not record his voice, only his tragedy. He became Nero's living doll, a beautiful and empty object, and that is how the world remembers him. But his story deserves to be remembered not only as a testament to human cruelty, but also to the astonishing resilience, even if it was the resilience of will in his final moment. By choosing death, Sporus reclaimed the one power that had been denied him throughout his adult life, the power to make his own choice about his fate. It was not a victory, but it was an end on his own terms. Sporus's story is not a heroic tale of emperors and battles. It is a reminder that behind the grand narratives of history, behind names like Nero, there are always human stories, stories of suffering survival, and the struggle to retain a piece of one's soul in a world that tries to steal it away. And in the silence, the echo of Sporus's tragedy still reverberates through the centuries, a whisper of a life stolen.